Good morning. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Rick. I'm the lead pastor here. If you have a Bible with you this morning, you can open it to the book of Hebrews. That's in the New Testament. It's not Ecclesiastes. You know, this is not encouraging. I'm just going to say it. In any other geographic context, we'd be saying fall's in the air and, football season started, and so it's a perfect time to kick something off. The book that we begin studying this morning, honestly, is one of the treasures of the New Testament. It is artistically written, it is theologically rich, it's the place where we've got a lot of kind of famous passages. If you've been Christian a while, reading the Bible a while, that you're probably familiar with. The Hall of Faith, chapter 11. Got the command of worship together. We hear that Jesus was tempted in every way but was without sin. The idea that the blood of bulls and goats never took away sin. That Jesus is the author and perfecter of our faith. All this stuff. This is one of those books that it gets a lot of press. But I wonder though if we've actually read it in the way that it was kind of intended, right? Every New Testament writing is written directed to a particular group of Christians for a particular reason, right? It's not simply a place to teach truth. It's actually intended to do something. And so I wonder if this was written, if we've read this from the perspective that it was written for. It's got a lot of great truths in it. But the book of Hebrews is trying to do something. And what is it trying to do? That's what we're going to try and do this morning, reading what is probably one of the most famous of the passages in this letter, and it's the first 4 verses. So if you have your place there, if you'd stand in honor of God's word, it'll also be projected on the sides and the screens. It's God's word to us. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. Through making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. This is the word of the Lord. Would you pray with me? Jesus, as we enter into this study, and even as we look at this passage, these short verses, Lord, help us to make much of you in our hearts this morning, in our minds as we think about your greatness, your glory. As we bring our doubts and our questions to you, we ask that you would fill our minds with your glory. That you would become bigger than those doubts, bigger than those questions. And we ask it in Christ's name. Amen. Have a seat. I want you to imagine something for a minute, if you would. It'll probably be difficult. Just going to warn you. But we're going to try, okay? I want you to imagine that you grew up believing in God. You were from a kind of a religious family, a religious background. You were taught about the problems of the world. Here's the problems that we engage in the world. But here's the promises of God, and here's the glorious future that God has planned. Just imagine this, okay? Then you discover the grace of God. You actually had been taught all these things, but all of a sudden you kind of discover his grace. You hear of Jesus who's come to finally bring all of these things to pass. He's the answer to all of these promises. He's the solution to all of the problems that you have been taught are in the world. You believe and you see that it is God's grace and not your work that will make all of these finally come to fruition. Everybody with me so far? I know it's hard. Just imagine this. Now I want you to imagine that after you've come to believe this, maybe a few years have gone by, 10, 20, a couple decades maybe. Life has pretty much gone on exactly the way it did before. Sure, some things have changed, but the reality is that you are still you. The world still the world. And everything you thought was supposed to happen, it really hasn't. In fact, now you're facing hardship amongst maybe even your family because of the fact that you've decided to follow this Jesus guy. So the thought enters your head, not publicly, of course. It would never happen publicly. You wouldn't speak about this in company, but you've thought it. Maybe Jesus wasn't the guy. At least he wasn't what we thought. He was good, sure. I mean, he was great. He taught some good things. He certainly, I mean, you can't deny the resurrection. Yeah, I mean, he raised from the dead. I mean, yeah, I mean. But maybe there's something more, right? Maybe there's something more to this whole thing. Something beyond him. Because your expectations haven't been met. Is that hard to imagine? My guess is it isn't. That's what prompted this sermon, which turned into the letter to the Hebrews. The idea that there's a group of people who had certain expectations of what life would look like after the coming of Jesus to fix the world, and it hasn't panned out. And so maybe we stick with Jesus to some degree, but we look for something a little more. So this morning, what I hope we're going to find is simply this. If our hopes don't rest on Jesus, they won't rest anywhere. If our hopes don't rest on Jesus, they won't rest anywhere. As always, there's an outline if you'd like to use that. It's there. But before we get into this passage, we need to better understand the situation, okay? So we're jumping into this book. Some of you are familiar with it. Most of us probably aren't, so let me fill us in. The book of Hebrews is probably a sermon. I already said that. It's probably a sermon. It has a lot of marks of something that's spoken. It's very, it has all these marks of oratory. It's put together in a way that if you were speaking it in the original language, in Greek, it would have this kind of artsy feel to it that would go into high oratory, right? There's consistent reflection throughout this book on several passages of the Old Testament, just like a sermon would. Passages like Psalm 2, like Psalm 110, Psalm 96, like they're quoted a lot. You have interpretation and application going into it. He talks about the book of Genesis. He talks about the book of Exodus and the generation that came out of Exodus, especially the second one. This is all over the place in this book. We don't know who wrote it. Some in the early church associated with the Apostle Paul. And it seems required, if you were a scholar who writes on this book, to take a stab at your idea on who wrote it. I've read a ton. You know, it could be Paul, it could be Apollos, it could be Priscilla, it could be Luke. The reality is it's anonymous. We don't know who wrote it, and that's okay, right? An early church father by the name of Origen said only God knows who wrote Hebrews, and I think he's right, all right? So now here's something that is going to be important for later. This letter was written relatively early. And by relatively early, I mean probably sometime before 70 AD. Here's how we know that. If you're familiar at all with this book, what you'll notice as you study, as you read through it, and I would encourage you to do that as we're preaching on Sundays, to kind of incorporate it into your kind of your rhythm throughout the week. But one of the things you'll notice is that the writer of Hebrews consistently makes reference to things that were going on in the Old Testament, especially the ceremonial worship of God. And one of the arguments he wants to make, and we're going to see it play out, is that those things were good for a time, but now they're done because Jesus came, and he kind of fulfilled these things, and we've moved off of that. And it's an argument that he makes over and over and over again. And it's an argument that you could just put the nail in the coffin of that argument if you were writing after 70 AD, because after 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the temple. You could have easily made that argument, but he doesn't. Probably because all of that's still going on. So it's written relatively early. Again, that's going to become important here in a few minutes. So just kind of get that in the back of your head. And I said earlier that it was kind of written as a means of dealing with our expectations of God that have been disappointed. So if you're a first century Jewish person, what are you expecting? Let's dig into that first. What do you expect is going to happen with the coming of Messiah? You've grown up with the Bible, you've read it, you've done all these things, you've heard it talked about and preached and taught. So what is a first century Jewish person expecting is going to happen when their Messiah comes? Well, there's a number of things that they thought would happen. The first and foremost being the final dealing of sin. How that was going to happen, they didn't know. They weren't sure, right? There was some thought that maybe somebody would come and finally kind of make a purification that was going to be final. Some of them just figured that God was just going to change everything and make it new. What they thought was Messiah was going to come, the resurrection was going to happen, God was going to deal with the Gentiles, those nasty, mean people who don't believe in God. He was going to get rid of them. He was going to judge them. The world's going to be made new. The presence of God is going to be among us. Wine flowing from the mountains. All these great things. There's your hopes. This is what you would have believed was going to happen when Messiah came. But now here's your reality. Life goes on. You still sin. The world's still broken. The Romans are still in charge. You've probably been kicked out of the synagogue because you follow Jesus. You might have even been removed from the marketplace, unable to do business because you follow Jesus. You're those weird sectarians, those Nazarenes, as they call them. So the reality is that these folks are tempted to believe that Jesus wasn't the guy. Maybe he was from God. Sure. I mean, he did crazy things. I'm sure he was from God. He may be even someone who was powerful or even prophetic. But how could he be the fulfillment of the hopes of the Old Testament if those hopes don't seem to be fulfilled? We see this over and over and over again in this book, and we'll come back to it over the course of our series. Things in the Old Testament are good, but our writer says Jesus is better. Angels are good. We'll see that next week. Jesus is better. Okay? And then the warnings. Don't leave Jesus, or there's nothing for you. That's what's going on over and over and over again in this book. All right? So let's jump into the text now that we've got some context. Look down at verses 1 and 2. He says this, "Long ago at many times and in many ways God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son." Now, two things about these verses. First, the contrast. There's a contrast going on, right? Long ago and these last days. Long ago, these last days, right? Now, long ago isn't bad. Again, this is important. Like sometimes, I don't know what it is. Steve and I have talked about this recently. I don't know what it is. But sometimes we tend to have the thought that if I'm saying one thing, I'm then also saying one thing is good, that I'm saying the other things are bad. That is not what's going on here. He's saying long ago was good. God spoke through the prophets. He did that. That was good. But now, there's another thing going on. There's these last days. Now, as soon as I say that, some of us, especially those of us who are a little older in the room, who can remember the 90s. Okay? Not all of you can, but most of us can. These last days brings with it this freight of Christian weird stuff. Right? Because it brings with us this talk of like the end times and all this stuff. You need to understand that for a first century Jewish person, these last days is a specific context. They understood the entire kind of history of the world and the future of the world to be divided into two epochs. Right? After the fall of man, after we're in the garden and everything's good, but then we turn from God, we betray him, and the world becomes broken. And when that happens, we fall into what they called this evil age. Dun, dun, dun. It's this evil age. And what they meant by that was here is an age governed by human sin and brokenness. With me? That's our experience, right? This age is governed by human sin and brokenness. But that age would come to an end. God said, we're going to put this to bed. It's not going to be like this all the time. I promise to make things better. And as the Old Testament plays out more and more, the promises get associated with eventually a singular person called the Messiah, and that person would come and would bring in the age to come. With me? This evil age, dun dun dun, the age to come. Yay! Okay? And they saw that as being a dramatic break. That when Messiah would come, everything would change. Everything would blow up, and he would come and do stuff, and we would go from this evil age to the age to come. That would have been awesome. But it's not what happened. Okay? It's not what happened. When our writer talks about the last days, he's talking about a change of epochs. That something has changed. For a Jewish person in the first century, that would have been understood as like the boundary lines of the age to come. But he's also talking about a finality. To talk about the last days implies that no further are to be expected. So when he talks about in the former times, in previous times, in many ways, God spoke to our fathers and the prophets, but now, in the last days, in the days in which we should not expect more, after this, he has spoken to us in his Son. No further speaking is to be expected. But it's also telling us that Jesus was the one that brought us into the last days. In other words, just because our circumstances don't seem like it, it doesn't mean that it hasn't happened. Now, we're going to talk a lot about that little, this evil age, the age to come, and all that stuff. And if you're college student, seminary student, you know what's coming, right? It's the overlap and the now and not yet. We'll get to all that in later sermons, but I just want to introduce it here, okay? Second thing I want to point out about this verse is the grammar. I know you thought you were done with that in 9th grade, but here we go. All of the verbs that are given in these verses, especially these first two, but throughout, all of the verbs are given in a form in the original that communicates a once-for-all action, not an ongoing one. A definitive action, something that has definitively happened in the past. Okay? Why does that matter? It's definitive. God did speak in the previous epoch. It's not bad. He did speak. And he spoke through the prophets. And when they say prophets, they don't just mean Isaiah through Malachi, right? They don't just mean what we mean when we say prophets. They kind of understood the entire Old Testament as being prophetic in a certain way, as those who read it. So he spoke through all the prophets. And that is done. That has happened. But he also spoke in the Son, which is to say, there is no further word coming. All of the New Testament is simply a reflection back on Jesus and what he did. Okay? Now, for you theology nerds, let me let you in on something. Everybody else can kind of just check out for a second. There was a late 19th, early 20th century theologian. His name is very Dutch. It's Gerhardus Voss. Gerhardus. Imagine writing that name, having someone call that name out in class. Johnny, Sally here, Gerhardus? Yeah, like that's his name. His name is Gerhardus Voss. And Gerhardus Voss talked about God's revelation as something that always followed his redemptive action. He would do something redemptive, and then he would give his revelation to interpret it for us so that we didn't have to figure that out on our own. Right? So God chooses Abraham, and then he talks about why. And then he does the Exodus, and he talks about why. And then he does the full redemption in Jesus, and then he reveals the why. And if Jesus' work is the final work, then there's nothing more to talk about, is there? Jesus is the final word from God. That's what our writer is saying. We shouldn't expect another. So in these verses, we see that he's the last hope, but he's also the best hope. Let's continue. He talks about speaking by the Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God, the exact imprint of his nature, and upholds the universe by the word of his power. Now, there are so many Old Testament allusions in this. So many that sometimes it's hard for us because we're not as familiar with them as the folks who heard this originally would have been. First, he talks about him being appointed heir, right? He appointed heir of all things. The idea of being appointed heir is one of ownership. Who owns it? Well, it's the Son. It's Jesus. Jesus is the one who owns things. But it's also the same word that's used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament to talk about how God gave the land to Israel. It's a sense of this is yours. It's this idea of ownership. So he says that Jesus has ownership, enthronement over the world. But second, he was the one through whom the world was made. So in the Old Testament, in Proverbs chapter 8, it kind of talks about wisdom. And wisdom is this thing that, and some of you teenagers, you've been reading Proverbs, right? With Jonathan's having you reading Proverbs over the summer. So you've probably read that in Proverbs 8, wisdom is this kind of thing that God was present with God and God used to create the world in wisdom. And that's kind of the way that the writer of Hebrews is kind of connecting the Son, Jesus, with that concept, with wisdom. He is being presented as the owner of all things and the creator of all things. And it's very important when it says he also created the world. That is a bit of a gloss. That word world is a bit of a gloss. There are Greek words for world. There's Greek words for earth. The Greek word used here actually means kind of the universe. Like all things. He's the creator of all things. Now, it's not just that, though, because we can read that and get the wrong idea, can't we? Oh, yeah, so Jesus was there at the beginning. God used him to create the world. He's just this really high being. Maybe even a secondary God, right? Well, that's not it at all. Look down at verse 3. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and upholds the universe by the word of his power. So, the radiance of his glory. There's two ways that could be taken. There's a passive way in which Jesus is kind of like the reflection. Like a mirror reflects the glory of God. But that's really not the way that what's going on here. More likely what's being communicated here is that Jesus radiates the very glory of God. And if you're someone who's kind of steeped in the Old Testament, you know that you cannot separate God from his glory. The glory of God and God go together. It's not like you can have God show up and not have glory. And you can't have glory show up without God. They are intimately connected. So if Jesus is radiating his glory, you have to understand that it's the fact that what makes God God, his glory, is there in Jesus. And he's the exact representation of his nature. That word exact representation is the word used to describe a tool that makes imprints in something. In other words, that when it makes that imprint, the exact thing is communicated. And that word nature is the word that the early church would use a little later to describe the unity of God. In other places, it's translated substance, that they are of the same substance, right? They're one God and three persons. All of these verses present Jesus as not just a prophet, not just a powerful being, not just a wonder worker, not just a good teacher. He is God himself. The church would later reflect on this and describe him as God the Son, the second person of the Trinity, both God and man united. In other words, if there is anyone who is qualified to bring about the completion of our hopes, it would be this one. It would be this person. Now, as soon as I say that this book is presenting Jesus as both God and man, some of us in this room are thinking, come on, Rick, isn't that what all crazy ancient religions do? Right? I mean, don't they all kind of just deify their leader and da-da-da-da-da? Well, I know that we've been told that, but there are a couple of things that you need for that to happen, right? Because that can happen. But let's think about what you need for that to happen. The first is time, right? If you're going to deify someone, the very thing that you're going to need is to not have anyone around who watched him burp. It's hard to deify someone, right? Who's human, who has human features, who does human things. But like I said, this book was written before 70 AD, which means well within the lifetime of those that walked with Jesus, that ate fish with Jesus, that he was laughing and hanging out with them and doing stuff with them. And I know we love to present Jesus as if he was just like this statue most of the time. He's fully human. He did all the fully human things except sin. All the others. You would need time to not have those people around. You would need time to kind of make legendary all of the, kind of embellish the stories and kind of make this, Hercules thing. Like, yeah, he became really strong and he did all them trials and became God. So first you'd need time. The second thing you would need is for that idea to be plausible. Now, like I said, I mentioned Hercules. In the Greek world, yeah, I guess it's kind of plausible. You have mental furniture for the idea of someone going from human to God. They kind of climb the ladder, do enough stuff that Zeus kind of says, okay, you're in. You have that in the Greek world. You do not have that in the Jewish world, right? If you're a Jewish person from like the smallest, and it was so great, like today as John was leading us in the Lord's Prayer, I'm sitting in the back and I can hear there. Over on this side in the back, there's a bunch of kids, and I can hear all their voices. I love that, right? If you were a Jewish person in the first century, from that age, when they're reciting the Lord's Prayer, you're reciting the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. One. It was the primary confession of the Jewish world. It was one of the things that they said, this is what makes us, and the rest of y'all wrong. God is one. There is no mental furniture for Jewish people to go, oh yeah, of course humans become God all the time. No, it does not happen. You need time and plausibility, and those are the very two things that don't exist in this context. The reality is that even earlier than the book of Hebrews, the earliest book of our New Testament, the Apostle Paul, the early Christian leader Paul, is writing the same kind of things about Jesus that this is. Within a decade, maybe 15 years after his resurrection and death and resurrection. If we're not going to take this passage at face value, then frankly, we need a better theory than this is just what primitive religions do. It makes no sense. Okay? So next, though, the question is whether Jesus, no matter how qualified, actually accomplished anything. Look down at verses 3 and 4. It says this. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he inherited is more excellent than theirs. Okay, two things I want to mention here. First, again, the grammar. I know. Here we go again. Just like when we saw that a final word has been spoken, here we're told two things. He made purification and he sat down. And both of those, again, are given in the form that says that something definitive has happened in the past. It is something that has already been accomplished. Now, what are those two things? First, cleansing from sin. He made purification. Not just forgiveness. This is very clear. It's not just forgiveness. He could have said forgiveness after he had gotten us forgiveness. But he doesn't. He says after purification. This is the work of a priest. If the first couple of verses of Hebrews presents Jesus as this great prophet who gives us the fulfillment of being a prophet, the final word from God, here he's the fulfillment of a priest. He is the one who made final and definitive purification from sins. After he purified sins, he says. Second thing he says is that he sat down. Now, some of you who may have been studying this book before or heard this kind of connect the sitting down with the previous thing, and I get that. The whole thing that priests don't sit down unless their work is done. That's why the priests never sat down. Okay, but that's not what this verse is talking about, okay? This verse, the seated thing, is a very specific thing. If you were a believer in first century Judea, being seated at the right hand of God is not about being a priest, it's about being a king. It's about being a king. And so, my Bible nerds, this is an allusion to Psalm 110. And here's why that matters. That psalm is about God enthroning his king. And again, the verb is definitive. He sat down. He is seated. He is enthroned. It is finished. We're not looking for something more. There's nothing more that would tell us that Jesus is ruling. He is right now ruling. And lastly, this kind of very seemingly out-of-place statement about angels. Right? This is kind of setting the table for next week, but as a preview. What our writer is trying to do is that the difference between Jesus and an angel, right? The difference between, I know, some of us struggle to even believe in the idea of angels today anyway. So let me think. Maybe the difference between Jesus and just a kind of a spiritual being, or maybe just a really powerful teacher, a really spiritual dude. Okay, let's go with that. Really spiritual. The difference is one of category. It's not one of degree. That's what he's trying to say. We're dealing with something so much better, so much greater, that what we're not dealing with is just something that's really, really powerful. We're dealing with someone who's utterly different than that. Entirely different, entirely greater, both because of what he has done and because of who he is. As much superior to them as the name he's inherited is more excellent than theirs. Okay? All right, so there's our passage. Now let's get to our need for hope. We started this with an imagination exercise, right? We were imagining what it would be like if we were believers in Jesus and then we were disappointed in God. Just imagining, of course. Because none of us struggle with that. None of us have ever been disappointed with God. We were imagining the temptation to maybe believe that Jesus wasn't enough. That we needed something more. That maybe we needed just a little bit more in our lives spiritually than just Jesus. But that's just imagination, right? None of us are ever there. Well, of course we are. This isn't a problem with first century Jewish converts to Christianity. This is a human problem. This is our problem. For some of us, that's wanting a new word from God, right? We do. Maybe that's because we want to believe, but God won't just tell us, at least not in our terms. Or maybe that's because we're not experiencing intimacy with God the way we think we should be, or we assumed we would when we became Christians, so we go on the hunt. We hunt through our experiences. Maybe God will speak to me in this church. Maybe God will speak to me with this Bible study. Maybe Jesus is calling over here. Maybe there's some way that I can get Jesus to speak to show me that he cares about me, what's going on in my life right now. I need that. Why isn't he speaking? We think, I know, Jesus. But how do I really know? How do I really know that God is for me? How do I really know that he knows what's going on with me? Maybe we look to people who claim to be spiritual leaders who can speak for God, offer us that new word that we want, and strangely never tell us anything that challenges us. Some of us, though, don't struggle with that. We don't struggle with wanting a new word from God, but we do struggle with wanting a further purification, don't we? We know that Jesus is enough for most people. He's enough for most people. But me? I mean, I know, I look around in church on Sunday morning and I see and I know, none of them are perfect, but they're not me. What they deal with isn't me. I'm really broken, right? I keep messing up. I can't get my stuff together. I watch everyone else on Sunday. They seem so much better than me. Jesus is enough for them, but I need something more. Right? Still others of us, though, we don't think about the new word or a new purification, but we do struggle to believe that Jesus is enough for our broken world, don't we? The world is not safe. And if we're being honest, we're reading our news feed or watching that latest video that's up, it doesn't seem to us that God seems too interested in the whole thing. Maybe there's a hope besides Jesus for that too. Maybe it's in my political party. Maybe it's in my political leader. Maybe it's in my social action. My hope was that God was going to make the world right, but seems to be waiting for something. But friends, here's the reality. There's a hope that we need to claim because this book is telling us that Jesus is the last and only hope for us. If you're struggling to know that God cares about you, maybe even that he's real, the writer of Hebrews is telling us, look to Jesus. Look to his word. The contrast in verse 1 isn't just between long ago and these last days, but between prophets who are great and the Son. The Son who declared, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. The Son who declared that God's love for the world is shown in the fact that he came, the fact that he suffered and died for people who couldn't have cared less for him. The Son who said that the Father has the hairs on your head counted and who you can trust with your provision. He is the best word from God, but he is also, friends, he is the last, which is to say, if you look for more, you will not find it, at least not from God. You're struggling whether to know Jesus is really enough for your sin. Join the club. You're battling shame and guilt. You feel stuck in these patterns, whether they look clean on the outside, right? Some of us feel stuck in those patterns like self-righteousness or greed, or your patterns are a little more train wreckish, right? Addiction or misusing your sexuality. And so you try to add to what Jesus has done because it can't possibly be enough, because it's not working. I'm still there. And the writer of Hebrews is telling us, look to Jesus. He's the only one that's made purification from sins. The only one. His work is finished. There is nothing you can do to add to it, and there's nothing you can do to take away from it. It is finished. This is the biggest difference between Christianity and every other world option out there. That they want to give you something you need to do. But the gospel gives us something that has been done in our place, done for us. It isn't about you making things up to God. You can't. It's not possible. It's about him making things right with you, and he has done that through Jesus. Friends, if you're struggling this morning, listen, I know, I've been there, I am there at times. You cannot out-sin the cross of Christ. You cannot out-sin his purification. I know you still struggle, and so do I. But there is no hope apart from Jesus, because no other hope can return us to the dependence on God that we were made for. Everything else just makes the problem worse. You're struggling to know whether Jesus is enough to rein in the evil that we see in the world. I know. It is so tempting in those moments to reduce our faith to the spiritual, isn't it not? I'll keep my faith in this little spiritual container that I take out on Sundays and maybe for an hour every morning. And every other day, or every other time, I need to look to something else to deal with the here and now. Maybe I do just need a bigger Caesar to fix my... Maybe Machiavelli was right. Good prince, bad prince, doesn't matter as long as he's strong and on my team. Maybe that's what I need. Friends, look to Jesus. Don't mistake mercy for weakness. Don't mistake his patience for weakness. Jesus reigns. The presence of any true justice in this world, any human flourishing in this world is there because for 2,000 years, Jesus has sat enthroned and he is exacting his rule. Yes, there are rebellious elements all over the place, not least right in here. But he is exacting his rule. No, it's not eliminated totally. That will happen when he returns to set things completely to rights. Like I said, now we live in this weird overlap. This evil age is still going on, and yet these last days, the age to come, is kind of broken in. We live in this period where his reign is truly here, but not fully. What's required is simply the power and grace of Jesus. He is our hope. That is what this book is about. That is what we're going to look at over the next several months. He is our hope. He is better than we could ever imagine. You could sit down to create your ideal Messiah. He will be better. He is God's answer to our problem. He is not an answer. He is the only answer. It will be found in him, or it will not be found at all. Would you pray with me? And so, Lord, we ask that you would give us faith to believe, faith to persevere in the truth that you are our best and our last hope, our only hope, God's intended hope. Give us faith to find in your word the word we're looking for. Give us faith to find in your purification from sins the purification that we long for. And give us faith to find in your reign the solution that we eagerly await. Do it for your glory. Do it for our good. And we ask it in Christ's name. Amen.